exactly that. It's you can make payments, you can buy stuff, you can ship stuff. But also Safaricom in Kenya, which is one of the leading lights, I suppose, in terms of Africa's own payment space, has also struck a deal with Alibaba. And I think in South Africa now, the biggest bank on the continent, Standard Bank, which is 20% owned by ICBC, a Chinese bank, they also are now creating, I think using distributed ledger technology, some kind of platform so that in the e-commerce space, South African companies and Chinese companies can better complete payments. Are we seeing something quite new emerging?
Yes and no. You're seeing the first kind of green shoots come up from Chinese companies like Alibaba and Tencent who owns WeChat, ICBC, and UnionPay is one of the interesting ones. UnionPay is the Chinese credit card company, and they are starting to install more locations around Africa. But I think it's very, very important that we understand what the Chinese are doing and who they're targeting. China does not, and none of these companies really are trying to establish themselves as African retail brands. What they are initially doing right now is facilitating the kind of go-between between Africa and China for business and for Chinese tourists. So, for example, when UnionPay is starting to set up their POS systems, their point-of-sale systems, they're doing it in places where there are Chinese tourists. I had a chance to talk with some folks from Tencent who own WeChat. And I said, why aren't you guys going in more aggressively into Africa? Why don't you build a light version of your app like Facebook Lite? Because the WeChat app is extremely heavy and very, very data hungry, which is two bad things in Africa because you have to pay for data. And they said, listen, at the end of the day, we still have 100 or 150 million people in China that don't have WeChat. There are about 110, 120 million outbound Chinese tourists. And there's about 142 to maybe 170 million Chinese diaspora around the world, including in Africa. So you add all of that up, and they're looking at almost 400 million people that are in the Chinese universe that they can target before they go to African retail. So I think it's very important for us to separate when we look at these headlines about what's the goal and objective of the Chinese side of this. On the African side, everybody's excited that this investment's coming in from China, and there's finally the big giants like Alibaba and Tencent have awoken to the potential of Africa, but they really haven't. Again, they're not trying to go after the Nigerian consumer or the Botswanan consumer. They want the Chinese business, they want the African business that's selling to China, they want the Chinese tourist. Those are the categories that they're going for. So I think it's an important filter to look at when you analyze these deals.
Well, there's also some excitement when you see Rwandan coffee companies being put onto the Alibaba network and being sold to Chinese consumers. There does seem to be the potential there for some interesting trade.
Yeah. In fact, when I left Shanghai in July, a South African container ship came into the port of Shanghai and they put fireworks over it. In the container ship, they had citrus on. And so they're looking to replace some of the products that they're buying from the United States with products they get from other parts of the world. So California and Florida citrus now they can buy from Egypt and from South Africa. They're looking to buy avocados from Kenya, more tea and coffee that's coming in from Ethiopia and Kenya and whatnot. And they are diversifying their agricultural buys considerably because they want to start to phase down their dependence on the United States. This decoupling is a real thing, and it's happening. Africa, for the most part, unfortunately, is not well positioned to take advantage of this because it does not have the mass industrial size agriculture to feed a market like China. In fact, Africa still cannot feed itself, much less export a lot of agricultural products abroad. Unlike, say, Brazil or South America that is benefiting enormously now from the trade dispute between the United States and China, selling soybean and beef and all these different things. That being said, Namibia just got its first beef exports into China this year after years and years and years of trying to get through. And so we're starting to see a lot of momentum now in African agriculture getting into China. The Chinese have very strict standards, there's no doubt, because they have 1 billion people who live oftentimes in a hot country very close together. And contagious diseases and infectious diseases are a real thing, as we know with African swine fever right now that is devastating the pork industry in China. So a lot of African exporters are complaining about the high standards that they must meet in order to enter into the Chinese market. So avocados, for example, leaving Kenya, have to first be flash frozen in order to prevent any bugs from surviving the trip. And there was a lot of grumbling about this, but then some Kenyan traders said, you know what, stop complaining. Go down to Peru and Vietnam and other countries that are exporting 5 tons a year of avocados, figure out how they do it, and let's copy them. And I love that attitude. And that we're starting to see now as well. No more complaining, figure out how everybody else is selling into the China market and just get to it. And that's starting to happen. So you'll see headline after headline after headline that I start pushing out onto Twitter and in the newsletters about, like, all of a sudden now it's coffee from Ethiopia, it's coffee from Rwanda, it's tea, it's specialty tea. And when you go and you live in China, it's very exciting. You go into the supermarkets and there you see it. You'll see all these different products from Africa just there as normal products. So South African citrus, Rwandan tea and coffee, and then even things like, shea butter from Ghana and chocolates and things like that are being branded from Ghana or from Ivory Coast and things like that to the Chinese consumer. And they are enjoying this idea of being able to sample products from around the world. And this offers another opportunity for Africa. And this is something where we really need to start to see African exporters develop it. Rather than simply export the raw cocoa beans that then a Chinese manufacturer brands and benefits from all the upside, is to start adding value before it leaves the port. That's really the next thing. So stop exporting out raw materials and commodities and start exporting out processed goods with more value that's retained in the African home country.
One of the other places where you hear a lot of complaining is Washington.
No shortage of complaining coming out of Washington today.
I don't know if you've been there recently, but they have a very particular take on China, of course, at the moment, especially with this administration. But I quite liked one of the pieces on your site recently, which said, we should stop complaining about the Belt and Road Initiative and see where we fit in, as the US or as a lead financier in the West. And that really struck a chord with me because it does seem that, if one of the big challenges of the 21st century will be finding a job for 2 billion people across the continent, that kind of approach, the sort of the Marshall Plan approach, the big infrastructure push, is just the sine qua non. It has to happen, and so anyone who is trying to make it happen should be helped, not hindered. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, so I was just in Washington, and I spend a lot of time in Washington and talking to people. That's where a lot of my newsletter subscribers and podcast listeners, number one city for my podcast actually is, in fact, it's actually not even Washington. It's Arlington, Virginia. If you know anything about Washington, you know that in the suburbs of Virginia are all the people who watch China very, very closely. That is the CIA, the Defense Department, the Pentagon, all of those, and the Beltway Bandits, which are all the private contractors that are all there. So there's a lot of interest. Unfortunately for Africa, the interest is less in Africa and more about China. And I think that's a really important thing. Even though people may be working on an Africa desk, they are now being tasked to have a China policy and a China kind of vision for things. And so this is all about China and containing or checking or challenging, whatever verb you want to use, and less about being proactive about China. We heard that, of course, in the Prosper Africa unveiling last year when John Bolton, then former National Security Council advisor, said, he mentioned China 17 times in a speech about Africa policy. That has now changed a little bit, but when, you take somebody out to Starbucks, 3 caffeine shots into it, they start to reveal to you that really they're more interested in China than Africa. So David Dollar, who's at the Brookings Institute, a China scholar who wrote that piece that you referred to, his words were that Washington should tone down its anti-China rhetoric. I think that reveals more wishful thinking in this day and age now, 12 months out or 13 months out from a U.S. election. It's hard to see that the Americans are going to tone down their anti-China rhetoric. It's just the coin of the realm right now. And interestingly enough, you hear from the Democratic candidates, and they say basically the same thing as what the Republicans are saying. It's one of the few areas of of commonality. So any expectation of a Marshall Plan from the United States into Africa, forget that. That ain't going to happen. So, that's just, there's no way that's going to happen. There is nothing in our politics today that suggests that U.S. taxpayers are going to spend billions of dollars building roads for Africans. Unlike the Chinese, though. And Belt and Road is part of that, of course. Belt and Road is not a Marshall Plan, because the Marshall Plan was really designed to kind of pull Europe out of World War II. The Belt and Road is a self-interested agenda from the Chinese. So there is some benevolence in it, but I would say most of it is self-interested. So again, I think confusing the Marshall Plan with Belt and Road is a risky thing. That being said, Belt and Road, they've spent somewhere north of $200 to $250 billion, and that is far above what anybody else has spent on infrastructure. And there is, even though they're slowing, there's still a big appetite to build infrastructure around the world for the Chinese, and particularly in a place like Africa, though they are getting more discriminating about what projects they choose to fund. So from the American side, I think we should keep expectations in check, and I think you always have to separate. Again, look at the motivations of the people writing these ideas. A guy like David Dollar at the Brookings Institute is an ideas guy. He's trying to get ideas through a system which is very, very ideologically polarized. And in Washington, there is a big gap right now between the operational people who run policy and the ideological people who manage the process. And getting ideas to cross that Rubicon from the operational side to the ideological side. So that is Mike Pompeo at the State Department and his kind of deputies are all ideological. And so what it means is that getting something to the president is extremely difficult if it's just based on an idea, like what David Dollar is doing. Because this is a president who is basically taking foreign policy into his own hands, or his thumbs, and he's tweeting. And so, and I don't mean to be dismissive about that, that is a reflection of the reality. So that's when we look at these ideas, know that they have a very, very difficult obstacle course to get through to the actual implementation, whereas, say, 10, 15 years ago, that wasn't the case. But in these ideologically polarized times, very, very difficult to get a Brookings Institute idea from paper into policy in a short period of time.
I mean, the flow of ideas has always been so important in development in all manner of countries. One of the things that came out of a recent book, which looked at the way China's own policymakers allowed massive different sorts of innovations to happen all throughout the 80s and 90s. Regional governments were given, very open hand to pursue different sorts of development agendas. And it does strike me that there is a lot that could be learnt from China's experience within Africa. Beyond my own obsession about avoiding the state market choice, and looking at the way countries all across East Asia, in fact, used a strong and effective state to galvanize the private sector. There are sort of very specific examples. Something I've been looking at recently are these township and village enterprises, which were very, very powerful in the 1980s in China, driving the sort of early consumer goods companies, and they weren't controlled by the central government, but they weren't owned by private entities either. They sort of had this sort of regional local government control. And a lot of them failed, but a lot of them laid the groundwork for some of the big companies that we know today in China. Have you seen many sort of examples of development ideas, before we think of a better term for it, percolating from China to various African countries?
Yeah, so this is all under the umbrella of the state capitalist or authoritarian capitalist model. And it is not a model for everyone, but in those countries that are more autocratic, less democratic, like Rwanda or Ethiopia, for example, increasingly Zambia, there is an appetite for greater role for the state in the market. And I think the key question in Africa, though, is that you can look at a Chinese model, but how much of that Chinese model, that village township or the state-owned enterprise or anything that's that hybrid model, maybe like Huawei in between, Again, Huawei's role